for joining me this evening. So what we have today is chapter 5 in your textbook. We're going to be looking at demand and supply in action. So in chapter 4, we looked at demand and supply in their essence, how we describe them. We looked at the words, the graphs, and the formulae that you can use to describe the different factors that impact both demand and supply. Now we're going to take a look at what happens when they are both subject to change. So if we look at the learning objectives for this section of the module, we're going to look at how you can draw these graphs, both demand and supply, and show how the movements to each graph impacts both price and quantity. We're going to be able to describe simultaneous changes and be able to explain what the resultant outcome is for the market, as well as how these different changes impact equilibrium. We're going to understand the role of government interventions. There are only 4 methods, so we will study 2 of them. With the aid of a diagram, we're going to describe what those government interventions look like. They typically form the basic strategy is either minimum prices or maximum prices. For minimum prices, I would ask you to think about the labor laws in South Africa. So we have a minimum wage rate. With regards to a maximum price setting, well, that's when government intervenes when prices are soaring too high. So they can come in and they can set a price limit, a ceiling, if you will. We're going to explain with or without a graph the welfare costs that are going to be as a result of government intervention. We will also experience that we have a welfare dispersion between both consumers and suppliers. Remember that whenever we're talking about demand, we're considering the consumer side of things. And whenever we're talking about supply, we're concerned with the producer side. So we did look at consumer and producer surpluses. So this is where government intervenes. They set either a price ceiling or a price floor, and that shifts the welfare distribution within the society. Either it creates more consumer surplus or more producer surplus, and sometimes a lot of the welfare is just lost to the system. So like we said, in chapter 5, we're going to specifically be looking at the changes in demand and supply, and we're going to be looking at simultaneous changes. So for the graphs, it's good if you're quite comfortable already, but if not, I would advise revising, that was correct, chapter 4 before you continue, just so that you have your feet on solid ground before you start approaching new concepts. The simultaneous movement sometimes has uncertain outcomes, which you need to be quite comfortable with as well, because you are simply going to be presuming an outcome some of the time, but it's obviously based in fact and history. So we will also be looking at the government interventions and how the social loss is actually calculated when these different changes happen as according to government policy. So when we were looking in chapter 4, we were shifting the demand curve. But we weren't necessarily concerned about market equilibrium. In this case, we were shifting one curve or the other. So here we are either, obviously, you guys remember, quick bit of revision, you've got price on your vertical axis or your y-axis, and you've got quantity demanded on your x-axis. Then you have your demand curve, which is always downward sloping. The reason for that is because people will demand less as the price is higher. If there is something, a factor other than price, which occurs within this market, if it is to the downside, so for example, we find out that there is a health scare about a product that we're looking at, Okay, let's look at Ozempic. Everybody loves this product, but as soon as we're concerned about it maybe turning us blind, the demand curve would shift to D1. On the other hand, if we found out that when Ozempic first came out, as a perfect example, it was originally intended for diabetics, but then we found it makes everyone skinnier. So we shifted the demand curve to D2. If, however, the demand was entirely determined by a shift in price, then it would simply be a movement along the original demand curve. In other words, from point A to point B, or from B to C, or A to C. Okay, on the other side of the coin, we have the producers. There we have a supply curve which shifts up and represents the law of supply, in the same way the demand curve represents the law of demand. So with the law of supply, because we're looking at it from a producer standpoint, we say that as the price increases, so more quantity will be produced. So obviously, if you see that the price is rising, for example, of oil manufacturers would then, oil manufacturers would then produce more oil to supply to the market because it's now becoming more profitable to supply to the market. However, when the price gets constricted by some external reason or for some external reason, then we will experience this shift to the left of the supply curve, a fall in the supply. And that is mostly determined by outside factors. For example, if there is a cap on the amount of oil that's going to be exported or produced, sometimes they do that. The OPEC sisters, OPEC gets together and they decide, okay, we're going to turn off the taps. The reason they do that is because they are trying to cause a shift in the demand curve. So when there's a fall in supply, they could end up achieving a higher price at the same quantity even. So as you can see, if we draw a vertical line from quantity 2 straight up, you'll see that where the line touches the second supply curve at S1, you can see that the price has risen even though the quantity is exactly where it was. On the other hand, if there is for example, when we were looking at the previous assignment, we had petroleum jelly and petrol as complementary goods. So as a result, if something impacts the price of petrol and it starts to rise, petroleum jelly would then be produced in excess because it's simply a byproduct of the product they actually need to manufacture. And because of that, that artificially moves the curve to the right because the shift has nothing to do with price. It is purely a market shift that has caused this increase in supply. If, however, exactly the same with demand, if the movement is along the graph, then you know that it is specifically price related because you already have the y-axis representing price. So what we are primarily focused on in chapter 4, we looked at your equilibrium position. So when we did the demand and supply curve, we were only going to move one of those curves, but we had an initial equilibrium. So on Monday morning, assuming the gold price is 2,500, then that is the equilibrium price for gold. Why? Because at that price, the quantity and demand, the supply and quantity demanded were met. Okay, so that is where we created a market and we found buyers and suppliers. So that's where we say that gold was last traded at the previous night, and the last price it was sold for is 2,500. Now assume by Tuesday morning, the gold price is 2,600. That is the new equilibrium price. Why? Because it is the new price at which demand and supply met and the transaction could go forward. If there is too much supply and insufficient demand, you will cause a suppression in your price, so price will drop. If there is too much demand and not enough supply, you will naturally cause an increase in price. Okay, because more people are going to be demanding the same limited quantity that's available. So there are factors that will shift the demand curve, and it is never a change in price. So these are non-price determinants of demand. Okay, I cannot state that hard enough. Okay, because that is often the mistake that a lot of our students make, is that they simply get lost in the case study and the specific story they're reading, and then they move the curves, and in some cases it's not necessary. So when we're looking at the determinants of the demand, if you've got things like price of substitutes, price of complementary products, like in the instance of petrol and petroleum jelly, if there's a shift in consumer income, so for example, if you were selling, okay, let's think of something. So if you're selling cars in South Africa, um, I'm sure you've heard about how the car industry has been impacted. So consumer incomes typically around 22,000 Rand on average in South Africa in 2025. So that means that we are now experiencing a lot of downward pressure on the car manufacturers that are selling here, because we simply don't have the income to keep pace, especially when you have this whole new import market that is competing for our local incomes or consumer incomes. And unfortunately, they're produced and sold here a lot cheaper. So then you can actually see that there'll be a shift in consumer tastes and preferences, because, there's one or other situation, or you go and see somebody's new, um, you know, I can't remember what those cars are called, but you'll see one of these new imports, see how well equipped they are, and that's the new benchmark for a car you expect in that price range. So consumer tastes and preferences also shift. For example, if you visit Switzerland and you try Swiss chocolate, and then you decide that's the only chocolate for you. Okay, so these things do happen. They do happen individually as well as in a trend. And also in chapter 4, we look at individual demand curves versus the combination of demand curves, because you yourself as a consumer have a specific demand curve. So there is a price you're willing to pay for the quantity you want, and you are willing to pay a lower price and increase the quantity. That's always what consumers want. However, if they are to increase the price, you will simply demand less until a point where you demand none at all, because it's simply out of your price range. The expected price of a product. So this happens a lot with brands. So if you expect a product to be, for example, a Louis Vuitton purse is probably about 7,000 Rand. If you expect to pay that kind of money for a specific product, and then you walk into the store and it's, say, 5,000 Rand on special. My goodness, yes, absolutely. Shift my demand curve. Okay, it's not the price itself. It is simply the expectation that I was going to pay more that makes me now, on the spur of the moment, demand more because I'm receiving a lower price. Now, this can be quite difficult to distinguish between in a test scenario, but just think about the time frame that you're operating in. If they're giving you the case study is happening in the current, or they mention the word expectations, then they are driving you towards a non-price determinant of demand. Okay, so it's not a movement along your curve, it is a shift of your demand curve. Also, the number of people in a household. So again, if you're looking at individual demand curves and how that rolls into aggregated demand, the number of people in your household, if, for example, you're looking at something simple that everybody consumes, like cornflakes, if you have two people that consume cornflakes in your house, you may only get through a kilogram in 2 months. However, if you have four people, you may get through the same amount in half the time, which unfortunately, it's not something that you readily substitute, so you simply demand more. Okay, so now we're going to look at it in a little bit more detail, and not just an overview, but specifically how the graphs are impacted, because in a test or exam scenario, you will have to be able to draw these. But luckily, they are very simple, all straight lines, price and quantity are always going to be on your Y and X axis. So at least there's consistency there. You're always going to start with your demand and supply curve with an equilibrium clearly highlighted. Okay. Now, let's assume that the consumer's income increases, okay, like we mentioned before. So we all of a sudden have experienced this boom in our economy. Incomes have increased, so therefore people have more disposable income to spend on things that they want. That would cause a shift to the right of the demand curve. Okay, as you can see in figure A, all we're doing there is drawing our original equilibrium demand and supply curves, and the supply curve does not move. In other words, we don't have to draw a parallel line for the supply curve. It stays as is. Why? Because only demand is impacted by something that happens to the consumer. If, however, on the right-hand side, there's a decrease in income, as we have experienced recently in South Africa, there will be a shift to the left. Remember this, like the thing about income is it can increase over, it tends to increase quite slowly over a period of time, and it tends to decrease over a period of time as well. So, depending on where you are in the market. For example, if we get a standard increase of between 4 and 6% in South Africa, um, and that's about our inflation targeting. But if you're in the unlikely event where you experience a 6% inflation and a 4% increase, you've gotten 2% poorer. So there are many instances like that. Often, whenever you have debt, like bonds, for example, any shifts in the interest rates will then leave you with less disposable income available. So it is something to bear in mind as well. So if, however, we are looking at an inferior good. Now, an inferior good is something that we purchase, but we're not overly concerned about. Okay, a normal good is something like a TV or a couch or something that, if it becomes cheaper, you'll buy more of it. An inferior good, however, if it gets, you know, if the income decreases, the consumer buys more. Okay, so for example, if you are experience ridiculous shortage for some reason in cash flow, and you are a smoker, you would buy matches instead of a lighter. Okay, why matches are what, about 50 cents a box? I actually honestly have no idea. Maybe a rand a box, whereas a lighter would be at least 10 rand. So, despite the fact that the matches are the inferior product when compared to the lighter, yes, I'm aware that we created lighters before we created matches, but nonetheless, okay, so toothpicks we set on fire versus some sort of mechanical system with gas contained within it. Um, if your income increases, you will buy more of the lighters and less of the matches. So this is a inferior product is an exception to the rule. You will typically buy less of it if your income increases. Okay, so there are, of course, also superior goods. So Louis Vuitton is essentially recession proof. Why? Because if the price goes up, it just means it's more exclusive and people buy more. Okay, a Balenciaga bag, it's more expensive the more people want it. Okay, well, we're talking about the price of a substitute for the product. X is the thing that changes. Okay, so when we are looking at okay, so let's look at a specific example. So here we have our original graph. So we're looking at perhaps coffee and tea. Okay, so, oh, this is actually happening now. So tea has very much stayed the same price. Okay, demand, it's hasn't shifted very much, but coffee on the hand has gotten more expensive recently. So there was an upward movement along the graph, okay, from A to B. If you can look at the graphs with me. Okay, why did we not shift the curves? Because the only thing that's changed is the price. Okay, as far as we're concerned, it's price that is directly being impacted. Now, the reason that we know that we don't have to consider this too much is because as soon as the price was impacted, it impacted something else. Okay, so there is a substitute product. So if you increase, naturally, if the demand for coffee, if the price of coffee increases, what will happen, even though nothing has happened to the price of tea already directly, people will demand more tea. So there will be a shift to the right for product X, or tea in this case. What does that mean? Is that simply because another product has become more difficult to buy, we then shift, despite our preference being for coffee, it's not quite worth the price, so we will rather buy the substitute. Okay, this very often happens. If this is a 10 mark question, then I would suggest drawing both graphs because it does explain that you understand what you're trying to represent. There are also complements, okay, like we saw with the petrol and petroleum jelly in the last assignment. Or, this is a much nicer example if we're looking at cereal and milk. Okay, so because you cannot naturally have cereal without milk, it's just unnatural. So if the demand for milk or the price of milk increases, there would be a shift leftwards in the demand for cereal as well. Because if you can't have the milk, you don't want the cereal. They work together. So the one moves to the left, or the moves upwards towards the graph, so the demand has shifted or the demand has decreased, then the demand for the complement product will move in exactly the same direction. Okay, so any increase in the price of milk will cause a decrease in the demand for cereal. But the reason for the demand decreasing for cereal has got nothing to do with its price. We simply don't have milk available, so therefore we have an excess supply of cereal. There are some people, weirdos, who would eat the cereal without the milk, but really, what's the point? So the rest of us who agree would stop buying the cereal until they bring the milk back down to a more reasonable value. Okay, there are also complements in. So when we were looking at petrol and petroleum jelly, we were looking at complements in production. We also have complements in consumption. For example, if you increase motor cars or motor vehicles are a huge economic indicator on the macro side of things. So when we have a decrease in the amount or number of cars that are being purchased, then it shows that we're in for a bit of an economic, problem. It's a blue trigger or an indicator of a recession or a suppression of the market in some way, shape, or form. So here we explain what's happened. So motor cars have increased in price, a simple move from A to B. That has caused a shift to the left in the demand for tires because naturally, if you don't have the car, not many people buy the tires. You don't buy Continentals or Hancocks or Pirellis so that you can make a tire swing. If you don't have the fancy car, you don't need the fancy tires. You don't even need to buy tires at all without the car. So a lot of things work that way. Obviously, there are more exciting examples. So if you are a brandy and Coke person, if you have the demand for a brand or the demand for brandy is impacted because the price goes too high, then a lot of the times the demand for cola will decrease. And this is particularly relevant in a sort of closed environment where you can actually see these two complementary products interact with one another. Okay. There are also changes in supply. Now, bear in mind, we are going to be doing both sides of the coin at the same time this time because we're going to have to be able to move them simultaneously. So any changes in supply are shown by shifts of the supply curve. A change in supply can be caused by any number of things in the same way, the same number of things that impact demand. And they're very similar as well, but there are some differences. So I would advise you to just make sure that you know the difference. There are whole tables, I think on page 85 in chapter 4, there are whole tables of the non-price determinants of demand. And a little bit later on in the chapter, I think probably around page 92, there is the same table for supply. You'll note that the supply table is slightly larger because there are a few more aspects that we need to consider. So when we are looking at the price of alternative products, again, substitutes and complements, we also have to consider the price of factors of production. So if the wage rate increases in a country, you make it more expensive to produce there, therefore you will have a shift in your supply curve. If the product of those factors of production. So in our country, we only have a 35% unemployment rate, which means that we are not particularly productive with our factors of production. Okay. The number of firms that are producing a product. So for example, when ChatGPT was the only AI we were talking about, it was, there was only one. It was only one. It's like it had a monopoly. It was like if you want to search for something, there was a typical term everybody understood, but it was a brand name. You'd Google it. If you wanted a hot tub, you don't buy a hot tub, you buy a jacuzzi. If you wanted, I know particularly in America or in the UK, if you want to have a tissue, they call it a Kleenex. So sometimes the brand actually monopolizes the product. But as soon as you have a number of firms entering, then it starts to, impact the supply as well, because now you have an increase in supply. For example, we now have a ridiculous number of AIs, but none of them has a monopoly, and none of them really, well, I suppose ChatGPT is still quite market dominant, but they are far from the only product being produced to that quality. So now you're far less likely to pay for the subscription because there's just so many more free versions available in the market. Again, expectation of future prices of production. So, for example, if we hear a rumor that there's going to be a strike in the mining sector, that implies that there's going to be a quantity drop off, which means that we would rather buy the gold now. Why? Because the prices are definitely expected to rise in the future. So we would cause a shift in the supply curve. People want to also supply more at this price, or sometimes, sorry, forgive me. If the price is predicted to go up, they may restrict their current supply of above ground gold so that they can sell at the higher prices. So sometimes, strike actions, not always the worst thing for the company if they can keep it under control and get people back to work before it impacts their long-term ability to survive. There are also government policies and natural disasters. So government policies where they say, okay, we're not going to be exporting this much, or we're only exporting, or we'll only be able to produce this much, or we have to put water restrictions in to restrict our agriculture. That can also shift the demand curve right or left. And then, of course, we've got natural disasters. Don't need to be too specific about that, but we will a little bit later on. So again, a change in the quantity supply that is impacted by price, just a movement along, and any non-price related factor will shift your demand curve. Your supply curve. I do want to just ask you to take a good look at that because sometimes it feels unnatural. But you are shifting your supply curve to the left and it is causing a fall in supply. So you've got a higher price point and a lower quantity. If you are shifting to the right, you are increasing supply, which means you're increasing quantity and most likely reducing price at the same time. Okay, now we're going to look at the change in supply. If the supply increases, the supply shifts right and downwards. If the supply decreases, it shifts left and upwards. Again, here are the factors that cause the supply curve to shift right and downward. So if the price of an alternative product, like a substitute, decreases, then there is likely to be a decrease in the demand for that product. So if coffee all of a sudden becomes cheaper, yes, we will instead buy the coffee rather than the tea. The tea is simply a substitute for the thing that we really want. On the other hand, if the alternative price increases, so if we need biscuits and tea together, and the price of tea increases, we would then decrease our demand for biscuits because, again, what's the point? Then there could be price increases. If the production decreases, and the firm will have to produce more of that particular product. So, or they will try to produce more. So, yeah, productivity of factors of production. If the factors of production increase in productivity, then firms can actually produce more of the good. Okay. So again, shifting to the right and downwards. That means that we have a drop in price and a new higher quantity. And then, of course, expected future prices. If the producers expect the price of a product to rise in anticipation, they will increase the production of that good eggs. They may not always make it available to the market immediately. Sometimes they restrict the supply and keep it for themselves until they are ready to pump in. If they are anticipating a future price rise. However, if the price rises immediately, they will want to take advantage while the price is still elevated. Factors that will cause the supply curve to shift to the left. Okay, again, just a quick rundown, but I will make these slides available to you so that you can also go through this and make your notes from it. So the price of alternative products like substitutes. So if the price of the product for X increases, so again, here's where tea gets more expensive, then firms will start producing the substitute and will continue to do so. So we had this example, instead of tea, let's look at butter and margarine. Now, I'm not sure which you prefer, but let's assume that you prefer margarine. Unfortunately, at the time, we shifted our demand, or actually, what happened was we found out that margarine was supposedly healthier than butter. So we had a shift in the demand. As a result of that, a lot of so we're shifting the demand for margarine. So we wanted more margarine. So what firms did was start producing more margarine. Now, for those of us who wanted butter, because the demand was so low, they instead kept producing margarine at a more and more efficient level. And then had to pay for the you had to pay so much more for the substitute because they were decreasing production and focusing on only producing the thing that people wanted, or the majority of the market wanted. So but the problem is now you pay about 100, you can pay up to 120 Rand for 500 grams of butter, and margarine's like about the third of the price. Also, there's about 16 different margarines you can buy, and maybe 2 or 3 different butters. So if we tell the market, if we tell the producers, this is the product that we're willing to pay for, that's the product they will produce. Okay, so complements, on the other hand, again, always work together. So if we see that the price of biscuits have decreased and therefore no one's demanding tea, or we can see that there's a decrease in the one, so we decrease the other, they move together. Okay. These cause shifts to the left typically, okay, but I've given you the specific examples for when they will actually shift upwards. The price of factors of production or other inputs. So, of course, you'll remember for the factors of production, we get rent, interest, wages, or profits. So if the cost of production increases, then firms will produce less of the product. If it becomes more expensive to produce, then we simply can't afford to keep producing at the level we were. We'll look at that more when we get to the second part of this textbook. So the productivity of the factors of production is always quite relevant, and you can obviously see how in South Africa it's quite a relevant thing as well, because we are producing less because our factors of production are not being employed effectively, and therefore less is being produced, and so we're sort of stuck in this almost recession cycle. Now, the number of firms producing the product, okay, so if a firm leaves the industry, the production of X will also decrease. So the same way that we have when we have a lot of firms entering the market because it's starting to look quite profitable, which is great for consumers because you see a shift in the supply curve to the right, which means we're getting more for less. On the other hand, if we don't keep the companies we want, like in the butter scenario, we push firms out of the industry and then we receive less of the product. Okay, so this very often happens in big markets. You have big shifts in trends. For example, Polaroid cameras were all the rage. Now they're coming back. They're making a comeback, but it took years. Um, and that was also technology improvements and things like that. But the number of firms that are entering can either destroy your advantage, and if one key player leaves, it can be quite devastating for the industry as well. Expected future prices in the same way, just vice versa. If the producers expect the prices of the product X to decrease in anticipation, they will start to decrease the production of product X. Okay, so if you see your product is about to be a lot cheaper, you don't want to be sitting with a whole lot of stock either. So in the opposite way, when we were trying to almost restrict our supply when we anticipated a price increase in gold, in this case, if we see that the price is going to be falling in the future, we don't want to be holding a lot of above the ground stock and watching it depreciate before our eyes. Okay, so here's a quick summary of the different graphs. You will also find these in your textbook, but I thought it's useful to summarize here as well. So if you've got a decrease in the price of factors of production, you've got a shift to the right. Why? Everything has become easier and cheaper to produce. Therefore, we have a shift to the right, which is always good for consumers. We have increased our consumer surplus. Same thing happens if we increase productivity. Shifts to the right are generally good for the consumer. On the other hand, any decreases in productivity will shift us to the left. Now we come to the part that gets very exciting, where we look at the simultaneous change in demand and supply. So the most important thing is you're going to start with your initial equilibrium. You're going to make out your demand and supply curves, and then you're going to highlight on each axes where your price and your quantity meet in order to get your market equilibrium, where your demand and supply curve meet. Okay. Then we're going to assume that both demand and supply increase first. Okay, so that means that both graphs are going to be moving to the right. So it's very easy if you start with this very simple these analytical steps. So what is happening? Okay, so I have one graph, I've got market equilibrium. Now, the first thing that happens is, okay, now both demand and supply increases. So that it leaves me quite uncertain. I'm not quite sure where these things are going to be working, so I'm going to draw it, okay? We don't know. The reason that we're uncertain about the outcome here is because we don't know the magnitude of the demand and supply curve shifts. So if demand has shifted further to the right, then you will have a increase in the demand for demanded quantity and an increase in the price as well. But if it is met by a shift in supply by equal magnitude, then you will see that the price maintains, it stays stagnant, and the quantity now just readjusts to a higher level. So obviously, if you're a producer, this is quite unfortunate because now you're achieving no price advantage. You are simply producing more for the market. Okay, so at least you're selling more products. Okay, on the demand side, okay, again, you also didn't benefit from a shift in the demand. You're paying the same price, you're just receiving a higher quantity. Okay, So if they shift by the same difference, then equilibrium quantity will rise, but equilibrium price remains unchanged. But again, this is very hard to determine if they're going to be moving in the same direction. Well, obviously, but to the same magnitude. So that's something you need to check. Okay, so what if they shift an increase in the demand and an increase in the supply? So they both shift to the right, but the quantity exchange must increase. Okay, so here you can see a very simple example of what happens when your demand shifts further than your supply. So we have demanded, this looks like what has happened with Ozempic. Okay, so Eli Lilly first comes out with this miracle drug. It starts at a basic equilibrium. Then people realize that it's just I don't know, it's like a medical breakthrough. They shift the curve way out. Okay, why? Because the quantity we demand is Q1 now. We move all the way out to the right, and we are willing to pay a higher price point. Okay, so now we would be sitting on a lower quantity and a higher price point if the supply curve didn't also move out to meet our new demand, but to a lesser extent. So this is actually what's happened in the market. We have demanded all of these weight saving or weight loss drugs, and the supply has come to meet us, but there is so much demand, they simply can't keep up. Even though there are more and more firms entering the market, they're just not keeping track with the demand. So because the magnitude of the demand shift was greater than the supply shift, what we have is a increase in quantity and a slight increase in price. Okay, so magnitude of the change becomes very important. Now, where we have this simultaneous change again, we have explained that it is dependent on the change in demand and supply and the magnitudes, most importantly. Okay, so on the left-hand side graph, it shows the demand and the supply where the magnitude of change in both is the same. Okay, so you can see there's perfect alignment there. If the demand curve shifts to the right, but the supply curve shifts to the left, you see that there is no real impact on quantity. The only thing that changes is the price. Why? Because at the same time that we have demanded more of the product, the supplier has restricted supply for some reason. And because of that, we are now paying a higher price and only receiving the restricted quantity. Okay. On the other hand, if we're in a scenario where our supply curve shifts massively to the left, so they've restricted supply for some reason, and at the same time we have a massive demand. So this very often happens with oil companies. They start shutting off the taps, and that's when we are heading towards an economic boom, and they're doing it specifically to increase price. Now, because we have increased demand at the same time that they have decreased to a large extent the supply, what we have is a restriction in the quantity, moving us from Q0 to Q2, and an increase in the price. Exactly what they strategically outlined at the outset. Okay, and in our final graph C, here we have a big shift in the demand curve to the right. So we had big increase in demand, just like with Ozempic. And unfortunately, in this case, there were massive restrictions against it. So the supply was restricted at the same time the demand was pushed out. Worst case scenario for the consumer. Why? We end up paying nearly 3 times the price at the new equilibrium. Because if we had stayed on the existing supply curve, we would have taken a price knock, but not quite to the extent, and we would have gotten the quantity that we wanted. Instead, we had to suffer less supply because they simply can't provide to the market. And because we're still competing, because we originally wanted a much greater shift in the demand curve, we are restricted and kept down to only Q3, when originally we probably wanted something closer to Q4 out here. Okay, so what actually is happening here and how we describe it. So, again, if the magnitudes are the same, then everything remains unchanged except for price, which rises. Okay, so your quantity is exactly the same. If you've got an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, your quantity decreases, your prices increase. If you've got an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, your quantity rises and your price rises as well. Okay, so the quantity exchange changes while the price in all three scenarios has increased. Okay, so here's an example of a 10-mark question that could be asked to you in a test or sorry, an assignment or an exam. So with the aid of graphs, show me the impact of the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in the market for tires if the following changes occur simultaneously. So here they've already told you you're drawing a simultaneous graph, and they've told you the two products that are going to be impacted. The price of rubber used in manufacture of tires is increased. So that tells you price of rubber is factors of production has increased, and the price of the motor vehicle, a complement of the consumption of tires, has increased. So if the complement of the product increases in price, it means that their demand has decreased. Okay, so what do we have here? We have seen a restriction in supply. Why? From a producer's standpoint, the price of rubber is increased. Therefore, factors of production have gotten more expensive, which means that they have to produce less. On the other hand, the price of motor vehicles, the complement for tires, because again, why would you buy tires if you didn't have the car? So when the price of cars gets more expensive, people stop buying cars and therefore do not demand the consumption of tires. Therefore, you'll see the same thing, a shift to the left in our demand curves. Okay, now because we say that these are occurring simultaneously and they've provided you with the hint to say that the change occurs in equal proportions. So the magnitudes are the same. You already know that this means that your price doesn't change at all. Your quantity is the only thing that shifts. But remember, in this 10-mark question, 5 marks are for that graph, and another 5 mark would be for explaining these different things. So like I said, you want to always start with your equilibrium. Tell us, because there will be so many simultaneous changes, it's very important to set a starting point for your markers. So show me where demand and supply intersect. Show me and highlight E1 on your graph. Then how the price increase, what the price increase has done to the supply and the demand curves. Okay, so you want to say that it shifted to the right or it shifted to the left, and specifically the supply or demand curve that has done that. And then what the resultant output is. So if the demand curve has shifted to the left, it has moved from D1 to D2. Okay, so you want to just outline what you've already drawn, but show us that you understand why it happened and talk us through your logic. Okay, here is just a table summary of the different changes in demand, changes in supply. And then again, because if you're not sure of the magnitude, it will be uncertain. Like I said, there is a simple procedure that we apply. You're going to determine when you receive your case study whether you're going to work out with whether you're working with demand, supply, or both. Then you're going to determine, and you can write above the words in your case study. Just give a little, demand curve, DD, SS, so that you know which, part of the question is applying to which curve, or if both are involved or just one or the other. Then you want to look at the direction. So is your demand increasing or is it decreasing? And the same thing for your supply. And then then you also determine whether these are shifts or are they movements along the graph. Okay. So if there is, once you do the actual shifts, is there a market shortage or a surplus? So if there's a A surplus. Okay, so for example, if the demand shift exceeds the supply shift, you could generally have some sort of market shortage. Okay, we want more than they're willing to supply us. Or if they supply more than we're willing to demand, then there's a surplus. Okay, so those movements in the graph can actually cause uncertainty in the price. If we know they're moving to the same magnitude, of course, we know that price will increase, but quantity is a bit uncertain. Okay. Then you want to show the change in both the equilibrium price, the vertical axis, and the quantity. So show me on the graph how draw little arrows to show that the price has increased or decreased and that the quantity has increased or decreased. Okay, so there is the interaction between these different related markets. Now, these are just a few examples. Okay, the one that we love to use is the quantity demanded of butter will decrease if the demand for margarine increases. Okay, these two, this is actually something that happened in real life, and because it was simply based on preference or distaste or taste of the consumers, it had a big shift to the demand curve to the left. And as such, eventually we had no price at all because the supply also shifted to the left in an equal magnitude. So they just stopped competing, really. Yeah, because if consumers no longer want your product, it's just pointless to still exist in that market. Okay, so then of course there are the complements. So where we looked at motor cars and motor tires, and then we looked at substitute. Fish and meat is another good example. Sometimes the price of fish it gets a bit high, and then we'll buy some more meat, and vice versa. Okay. Always remember that substitutes tend to work in opposition to one another. So if your product A is your market for fish, if it moves to the left in demand curve, then your market for meat will move to the right. You cannot assume whether you know the relationship between these two products. So you can't assume that that there are substitutes or complements. They have to tell you, okay, unless it's something really obvious like tea and coffee. Although, again, assuming is a dangerous thing. So, the same thing happens when you have complements, they tend to move together. Okay, so if you've got if there's an increase in the cost to manufacture a car, so anything could have happened at more expensive factors of production. The supply of cars will decrease, the equilibrium price of cars will increase, and the equilibrium quantity will decrease. So, what has happened is that it's become more expensive to produce. This is exactly what is happening to us now as a result of the tariffs. So, it's become more expensive to produce in South Africa. So, we've got a shift in the supply curve. They've put Mercedes-Benz on a short time. A lot of car companies have left our country, and we, especially in the Eastern Cape, are very manufacturing based. All our industries are manufacturing based. So when they start to leave, it tends to have a massive impact on our consumer income in this area. But apart from that, the market for tires. So, as a result of the market for cars now being suppressed by these tariffs and making everything more expensive, the supply has shifted and the demand for tires has also decreased because if you don't own the car, you don't need the tires. And as a result, it would be silly because of this demand shift, the price of tires will decrease and the quantity that we demand decreases at the same time. Okay, these you'll notice are individual moves. So we're not moving both the supply and the demand simultaneously. We're moving one or the other. So we're looking at related markets now. So the one market is impacting the other. We're not looking at one market that's impacted by multiple factors. Next, we get to the fun part. Okay, so this is covered in, I believe it's in page 104 of your textbook. This is where we start looking at government interventions. So very often, government gets involved and they start either granting subsidies to firms, they start taxing certain products. So if they want us to produce rice within our country so we can import less, for example, government could provide subsidies to rice farmers, and that would make them internationally competitive because it would lower their actual costs. And shift some of the costs onto government, therefore allowing them to be more internationally competitive and competitive with consumers. On the other hand, if government doesn't want us to produce or consume something, they can tax us. So if they don't want us to import a lot of foreign cars, they can put an additional tax on them, an import tariff. If they don't want us to drink a lot of alcohol or smoke a lot of cigarettes, they can apply sin taxes. There's lots of different ways that government can manipulate our consumer behavior. Okay, I have provided you with some exam questions at the outset, just so that you can go through it in your mind and know what's going to be expected of you. Essentially, we're going to be drawing the same demand and supply curves, but government interventions tend to be a straight vertical line from the price. So they come in and they say, okay, now we're going to have a minimum price or a maximum price. So you do need to understand what subsidies and tariffs are, but you don't need to be able to draw them graphically in a diagram to represent what they actually do. Okay, so you're going to explain the reasons for the intervention. This was part of an assignment earlier on this year as well, where you had to justify government's intervention in the market, but then also understand what the consequences of those interventions are. So whenever government intervene, they do it with the idea of equity. On the other hand, markets operate on the assumption of efficiency. So, where a market uses price as a mechanism to determine who gets what goods, because we're simply saying if you can afford it and you're willing to spend the money, you can have it. But on the other hand, what government is saying is this is the price and these people can have it. So they come in and they are focused on the equity of distribution, whereas a market is more concerned about the efficiency of allocation of resources, and we use price as a mechanism to determine how we allocate our resources to produce what we need. So when government intervenes, what we tend to lose is there's always a social loss because the market is quite efficient. It creates a natural mechanism to provide for the people who are willing to essentially work for it. And in a more restricted market, obviously, if the government is telling you what you will pay people or what you will sell your product as, it does limit a lot of your ability to meet market demands. So we're going to explain with and without a graph how these welfare costs are actually shifted across different social groups. Okay, so here we're going to revisit this figure from 4.10 in chapter 4, because this simply showed that what happened when we didn't reach equilibrium. So if we were in any of the scenarios here, so if we were in point D, you'll see point D or point F, what you'll find is that we had an excess supply. So we were only demanding 120 units of tomatoes, but because we were willing to pay 7 Rand per kilogram, the suppliers were willing to provide at point F. Now, what we have, because we are now not interacting one-on-one, we are not going as individual consumers to a farmer and asking him to make a deal with us, which would result in a 7 Rand price point. Instead, we're going to a market and we're looking at hundreds of different farmers and we're saying, okay, who's going to give me the best deal? And we're going to get, because there are so many farmers competing and so many consumers competing, what we do is the market naturally finds an equilibrium at price of 5 and a quantity of 200. Okay, no one's quite happy because the supplier would have taken 7. We are very happy because we didn't have to pay 7 Rand. We got our price at 5 Rand. But the supplier, the producer, was going to have to produce 300 tomatoes to meet our demand at 7 Rand. Instead, he has to produce only 200 and he still gets a good price point of 5. This supplier, however, was willing to take just 2 Rand at point B. Okay. At point So what we have encouraged him to do, so at point B and point C, what you have is an excess in demand, because at 2 Rand, this producer was willing to produce just 50 units, but clearly it was not very profitable for him to do, so he will only produce those 50 units. On the other hand, we at that price demand more tomatoes than we would ever consume, 320 kilograms. And so you have this excess demand. Okay, guys, we have been going for quite a while. So before I go over, all I want you to know is that naturally what happens is that we have a rationing and allocator function when we use pricing. When we have intervention in the market, so for example, what a government will do is come in and set a maximum or a minimum price at 7 Rand. Okay, this has a massive impact on this whole equilibrium, the market we established. Now, this is what has happened to our employment statistics at the moment. We have a natural demand for this many people, okay, that we can employ within our country. But at 7 Rand, at our minimum wage rate of nearly 20 Rand an hour, obviously there are far more people who are willing to work than people who are willing to pay someone nearly 160 Rand for a day without knowing what they're going to deliver. So, on the one hand, we're like, yes, I'll work for 160 Rand, but the market is saying 160 Rand, you have to be able to deliver me 160 Rand's worth of value at least. So this is where we have this massive excess in supply because government has intervened and put this line here, okay, above the market equilibrium, because government only comes in and sets a price minimum above the natural equilibrium. So what was naturally happening is that if you, like 60% of the people in our country don't have matric, now you're expecting a business to pay 160 Rand for someone they can't guarantee can do the job because they don't have the minimum requirements for the job. Now, if, for example, we didn't have the minimum wage rate, the market would find a natural equilibrium. It may not be at a price point that we like, but obviously but it does incentivize people to get educated because you can't naturally just expect a high salary or a living wage. Fair enough. But you actually have to, as you work, the market will determine that you are worth more money. So there'll be a natural element for those firms to find you because you are willing to work for a certain amount of money and they are willing to pay you for the amount of value that you bring. Okay, so the other case that happens is when governments intervene is when they create excess demand. This is when they come in and they set a minimum price. Okay, so a maximum price. So maximum prices are always set below equilibrium price. So this often happens when we have something like a wheat shortage. Now that is wheat is a subsistence product in our country. A lot of people use wheat and grains to survive. So when there is a shock to the market, which we've had recently, when electricity goes down, water becomes a problem, everything becomes a problem. Agriculture experiences these different shocks in the form of droughts, etc. And then they experience this shift in the supply curve. Now, at this price point, they are only willing to supply B. They were willing to supply up here 200 tomatoes, but unfortunately, because government has intervened and set a lower price point, you simply make it unprofitable to produce at a higher rate. So here we have demand far in excess. So we want more grains available. We're willing to pay for it. We will be willing to pay for it and then meet them halfway. But because government intervenes, we don't have the opportunity to find our equilibrium. So therefore, we just end up living with this excess demand. And again, we will, in our next lesson, we will look at how that specifically impacts welfare and how you're expected to talk about it in the assignment and the exam. All right, guys, that concludes my very long-winded winded lecture for the evening. I hope I haven't bored you too much, but please let me know if you have any questions. Just email me and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. And otherwise, have a lovely evening. Thank you.